Okay, so today we're tackling a pretty tough reality. How close are we really to a kind of breaking point with biological invasions?
Mm.
Trying to predict that future risk from alien species, it's just incredibly challenging. You're mixing global economics, environmental change, human behavior.
It really is a classic wicked problem.
Yeah.
For other big threats to biodiversity, think climate change or large-scale land use change, we often have these quite sophisticated quantitative models.
Yeah, trying to predict down to the degree or the hectare.
Exactly. But biological invasions, they're so specific to context that data gathering is, well, inconsistent at best. Those kinds of predictive models often just fall short.
And that difficulty, that gap, is precisely why the paper we're diving into today is so important, I think.
Definitely.
We're looking at drivers of future alien species impacts, an expert-based assessment. It's led by Essl, Lenzner, and actually a large group of collaborators, 36 experts in total.
Quite the team.
And their mission was pretty direct. Look, if we can't reliably model the future of invasions, let's ask the world's top experts. Let's get their assessment on how these different global drivers are likely to shape the negative impacts of alien species, say, through the middle of this century, so
Right.
up to 2050.
Yeah, and what's really key there is that reliance on collective expert wisdom. They essentially bridged a critical gap in our predictive ability. They used structured expert knowledge elicitation methods like Delphi or horizon scanning.
Right.
It's a necessary approach when the sheer complexity of the problem just outruns the available data. It shifts us away from pure assumption towards something more grounded in, years of collective specialized experience from people working on the ground.
And before we get too deep into the how, let's just drop the main takeaway, the big number that jumped out.
Go for it.
The experts were highly certain, really confident, that a surprisingly moderate increase in alien species invasions, just 20 to 30% compared to now. That's enough to trigger what they specifically defined as major negative impacts on biodiversity in most places, most contexts.
Wow.
A 20% jump, I mean, that feels like a razor-thin margin for error, doesn't it?
It really does. That finding alone, it just underscores the fragility, the vulnerability of certain ecosystems and contexts. So yeah, let's unpack how they arrived at that number and what major negative impact actually meant in this study.
Okay, so methodology. Since those traditional models weren't quite cutting it, the authors tapped into expert knowledge. They held a workshop, initially with 25 scholars, to identify the key forces at play.
Right, they boiled it down to 15 key drivers. Things grouped into broader categories like global environmental changes, socioeconomic activities, even societal responses like policy.
Then they developed a detailed survey based on these drivers. This went out to 36 leading experts in invasion science globally.
And they got a great response rate, too, something like 72%, which is pretty high for this kind of expert survey.
Impressive. And these experts provided assessments across a whole range of contexts. Different xenobiomes like terrestrial, freshwater, marine, different taxonomic groups, plants, vertebrates, invertebrates, microorganisms, and different realms, too.
And crucially, they weren't just vaguely assessing impact. They had a very clear definition for a major negative impact.
Okay, so what was it?
For the purpose of the survey, it meant a really substantial change in the local community. Things like the local extinction of at least one native species, or a severe decline in several native species. Or alternatively, substantial changes to how the ecosystem actually works, its properties or functioning.
So we're not talking about minor shifts. This is significant disruption.
Exactly. It sets a pretty high bar for what constitutes a major problem. They weren't asking about any impact, but major impact.
And to get the full range of possibilities, they didn't just assess the present. They looked at two potential futures for each of those 15 drivers.
Right. A worst-case scenario, which represented the most plausible negative way that driver could develop by 2050. And a best-case scenario, which painted a more optimistic picture where, society actually gets its act together and takes focused steps to mitigate that specific driver.
That contrast seems vital. It lets you separate out what might happen no matter what versus what we could potentially prevent.
Precisely. It helps isolate the preventable risk from the sort of baseline risk we might be facing. It tells us where our actions can genuinely make a difference.
Okay, so let's circle back to that headline finding then. That threshold for major impacts sits somewhere between a 20% and 30% increase in invasions compared to now.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting because that vulnerability, that threshold, It wasn't the same everywhere.
Ah, okay. So where are we most vulnerable? Which places hit that major impact point with the smallest increase?
The contexts the experts flagged as having the lowest threshold, needing only that 20% increase to tip into major negative impacts, were terrestrial and freshwater environments. Also, interestingly, countries with emerging economies.
Okay, that makes some sense. Maybe fewer resources for management.
Potentially, yeah. And taxonomically, both vertebrates and microorganisms came in at that lowest 20% threshold.
Hold on a sec. Vertebrates like mammals and birds and microorganisms, they have the same low vulnerability threshold. That sounds odd. Why would something complex like a bird be just as susceptible to that small 20% increase as, say, a bacterium?
That's a really sharp question. It does seem counterintuitive at first glance, but it actually reflects some core mechanics of invasion biology.
Go on.
Well, for vertebrates, that low threshold might be because many have slower reproductive rates. So when a really aggressive new predator or competitor or even a disease arrives, they just can't adapt or recover quickly. A relatively small number of successful invaders can have catastrophic effects.
Right, vulnerable populations.
Exactly. Now, for microorganisms, the vulnerability comes from a different place. It's about their sheer potential volume, their incredibly rapid evolution, and how easily they can be dispersed globally. Think about ballast water or soil on imported plants.
Ah, so it's the ease and scale of invasion for microbes versus the population fragility for vertebrates.
Precisely. The underlying risk mechanics are different, but the outcome, hitting that major negative impact threshold, apparently requires a similar, relatively small increase in the number of successful invasions for both groups, according to the experts.
Okay, that really does paint a stark picture of how fragile some systems are. So tying that thin margin back to those best case, worst case scenarios, what did the experts find?
Well, under the worst-case scenario, the consensus was overwhelming and pretty grim.
Uh-oh.
Experts were highly certain, almost unanimous, that basically all 15 of those drivers would contribute significantly to pushing us past that major impact threshold. It was seen as almost a guaranteed disaster if things go badly across the board.
Yikes. Okay, is there any good news? What about the best case?
Ah, yes. The best-case scenario is where you see the potential for change. Here, the results were much more varied, much more heterogeneous,
Meaning?
meaning it clearly showed that targeted, focused, maybe even aggressive actions on specific drivers could substantially reduce the potential harm. It proves the future isn't set in stone. It's conditional on the choices we make.
Okay, that's crucial. So we know the danger zone starts at a 20% increase for many systems. We know the worst case pushes us way over. What about the best case? Even if we do everything right, which forces are still the biggest threats? Which ones keep pushing us towards that threshold regardless?
Right, that brings us to what you might call the most persistent pressures, or maybe the big three drivers that stood out. Even under the best-case scenario, three drivers consistently emerged as significant risk factors across almost all contexts.
And they are.
Number one, almost universally, was trade and transport. Second, climate change. And third, socioeconomic development.
Okay, let's break those down. Trade and transport, number one, nearly everywhere. Why is that so dominant? I mean, except the poles, you said.
Yeah, it only yielded the top spot in polar regions,
Yeah.
likely because current trade volumes there are still relatively low, though growing. But elsewhere, it's the primary engine of global species movement. It's just fundamental.
How so?
Well, any change in global trade patterns, the sheer volume of goods moving, where they come from, what kind of goods they are, directly ramps up what invasion biologists call propagule pressure.
Propagule pressure. Remind us.
It's essentially the number of individuals of an alien species introduced to a new location, and how often those introductions happen. More ships, more planes, more packages, more pathways. It just means more shots on goal for an alien species trying to establish itself.
And those pathways themselves are changing, aren't they? We've got new modes like e-commerce, the internet trade you mentioned. That must be incredibly hard for agencies to monitor and regulate.
Absolutely. It's diffuse, often small scale, but massive in aggregate.
And then there are entirely new routes opening up, like the Arctic shipping lanes becoming more accessible because of climate change. That shortens travel times, right? Which could increase the survival chances for species hitching a ride on hulls or in ballast water.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of two of these big three drivers working together. Trade and transport enabled by climate change.
Okay, so let's talk climate change, the second driver. It's not just about opening routes, is it?
No, not at all. Climate change fundamentally reshapes the environments themselves. We're talking changes in average temperatures, shifts in precipitation patterns, more frequent extreme weather events like droughts or floods. This changes the basic rules of where species can survive and thrive.
So areas that weren't suitable before might become welcoming.
Precisely. Existing models already predict a significant expansion of climatically suitable areas for many known alien species under future climate scenarios.
And the paper highlighted the poles again here, didn't it? The experts seem particularly concerned about polar regions regarding climate change impacts.
They did. The potential impacts from invasions were seen as especially likely in polar regions, and that lines up directly with projections showing these areas will experience some of the most severe climate change effects. So it's kind of double whammy for those ecosystems, rapid environmental change, and increased vulnerability to invaders adapted to warmer conditions arriving.
Okay, driver number 3, socioeconomic development. That sounds a bit broader. What does it capture?
Think of it as a kind of proxy, really, for the overall scale and intensity of human activity and its environmental footprint. It reflects things like GDP growth, resource consumption, energy use, urbanization, infrastructure development. Basically, the volume knob of human pressure on the planet.
Right. The more we develop and consume in certain ways, the more we disturb habitats, use resources, and move things around, all favoring invasions.
Exactly. And projections suggest that volume knob is going to be turned way up. The study mentioned a potential 75% increase in the global material footprint, the sheer amount of raw materials we extract and use by 2050 compared to 2015.
Wow, 75%.
Yeah, that scale of increase in resource use, energy demand, consumption, land conversion, it makes a corresponding increase in invasions seem almost inevitable, even if we try to manage other aspects better. It's the sheer weight of human activity.
So those three, trade, climate, socioeconomic development, are the big overarching pressures, even in optimistic scenarios. But the study also found some drivers were really important in specific places or for specific types of organisms, right?
That's right. Not every driver is equally important everywhere. Context matters hugely.
Okay, give us an example.
Well, demography and migration, for instance. Changes in human population density and movement. This driver was ranked as the second most important, right after trade, specifically in tropical and subtropical regions.
Why there specifically?
The connection seems to be that projected increases in population density and human migration in many tropical and subtropical zones often lead to more habitat degradation, fragmented landscapes, and intensified land use. And those kinds of disturbed environments often favor the establishment and spread of opportunistic alien species.
Makes sense. What else?
Another one was recreation and tourism. This popped up as particularly important, often second or third ranked for invertebrates and microorganisms.
Ah, the little things again. How does tourism drive their spread?
Think about it. If global tourism potentially doubles between, say, 2010 and 2050, even under a best-case management scenario, that means a huge increase in movement of people and goods. Plus, tourism often drives infrastructure development, new roads, airports, accommodations. Roads can act as corridors for spread.
And people bring things with them, accidentally or intentionally?
Exactly. And tourist accommodations often use ornamental plants and landscaping, many of which can be alien species, providing new sources for introductions right where people congregate.
Okay, one more context-specific one.
Let's mention eutrophication and pollution. This was seen as highly important in many aquatic systems like lakes and rivers, and also in terrestrial systems.
Why pollution?
Basically, changes in the chemistry of ecosystems, especially adding excess nutrients like nitrogen, that's eutrophication, tends to favor species that are fast-growing, highly competitive generalists. And often, invasive alien species fit that profile perfectly. They can outcompete natives in these altered, nutrient-rich conditions.
Okay. But didn't the paper have a surprising finding related to pollution in the sea?
Yes, this is a really important point, almost a caveat to consider. While pollution ranked high overall, the expert consensus was that eutrophication and pollution were not expected to be strong drivers of future marine invasions.
That does sound odd. Isn't there a lot of focus now on marine litter, especially plastics acting as rafts or vectors for alien species to travel across oceans?
There is. Empirically, we know marine debris, particularly plastics, can transport organisms long distances. So, yeah, it's peculiar that this wasn't strongly reflected in the expert consensus for future marine impacts.
So why the disconnect? Did the experts just miss this? Or maybe downplay it? You mentioned they were mostly Western academics. Could that be a factor?
It could suggest a couple of things. Maybe a slight lag between the cutting-edge empirical findings about plastic rafting and its integration into the broader expert assessment of major ecological impacts. Or, perhaps, while the mechanism is known, there wasn't yet enough large-scale data confirming it consistently triggers those defined major negative impacts. local extinctions, severe declines across marine systems yet.
So maybe the impact hasn't scaled up enough to register in that specific way for the experts.
Possibly. But it also touches on the inherent limitations of any expert-based approach, which the authors were actually quite upfront about. The findings are always contingent, to some extent, on the specific knowledge, experience, and even the potential biases of the expert group consulted.
And what were the specific limitations they acknowledged about this group?
They pointed out the group was somewhat biased towards male respondents, typically in higher academic positions, and geographically, there was a strong weighting towards expertise based in Europe and North America.
Okay, so a predominantly Western senior academic perspective. How might that influence the results?
Well, it means the conclusions, while definitely robust within that framework, are inevitably filtered through that specific lens. For example, you mentioned the high vulnerability of emerging economies, that 20% threshold. Insights into the unique challenges or drivers most relevant in, say, the Global South might be less prominent if direct local expertise from those regions is underrepresented in the consensus pool.
So more diverse voices needed in future assessments.
Absolutely. This study itself suggests future work really needs to involve experts from a much wider range of countries and backgrounds to fine-tune these findings and capture regional nuances more effectively. There are still uncertainties.
Okay, pulling this all together then, what's the big message for us, for policymakers?
I think the core message is stark, but also holds a degree of hope. It's clear that future impacts from biological invasions are highly likely to be severe unless we act decisively.
But action can work.
Yes. The findings give us a strong scientific basis for prioritizing actions. We now have expert-derived benchmarks for those impact thresholds, that 20–30% range. And we have a clear identification of the most potent drivers, like trade, climate, and development, that need urgent global attention. This is critical input for things like the Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 framework, or the UN's 2030 agenda.
So the potential for harm is huge, especially under worst-case scenarios. But the analysis also shows real opportunities, real potential to reduce that harm significantly if we pursue those best-case strategies.
Exactly. The door isn't closed, but closing. Implementation is, of course, the massive challenge.
Right.
This study really finishes as a call to action. It states quite clearly, rapid and comprehensive actions are necessary to use this potential. Predicting the future risk is vital. It's the first step. But the real test is turning that knowledge into effective action on the ground, globally.
So let's leave our listeners with something to chew on, building on that. Given that trade and transport emerged as the #1 driver almost everywhere, what specific best-case policies, beyond just more customs inspections, do you think could have the biggest, most immediate, and implementable impact against that particular pathway? It's not easy, right? Something for all of us to really mull over as we look at the next few decades of escalating risk.